Hello and welcome to the programme which looks at the Holy Land. I am Paul Calvert. Genesis 12 verse 3 from the New King James Bible says this: I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I'm with writer and broadcaster Johnathan Sacerdoti, and today we are talking about anti-Semitism. Has the UK seen a rise in anti-Semitism since the October the 7th attacks?
Well, I think undoubtedly there has been a rise in anti-Semitism in many people's everyday life. So whether it's a question of discrimination in specific day-to-day issues, for example, in accessing healthcare with the NHS, or even in going to shops where people see overt signs of support for Hamas and Palestinian terrorism, or whether it is in the mass street marches organised by some people who go to the streets of London and other cities around the UK and chant for effectively the end of Israel with their genocidal chanter From the River to the Sea, and plenty of others as well, which allude to Islamic military slaughters of Jews, such as that in Khyber with their chant Khyber, Khyber, Ya Yahud. So I think that for many Jews, life has become depressingly much worse, and that is something which is a stark warning to everybody, because if we tolerate that kind of anti-Semitism, racism towards Jewish people, it's really just the start of things, and that's not a good sign for society.
Has it become so bad that Jews feel they need to leave the UK, and would they come to Israel? So are they that scared at the moment that they feel the pressure's on so much?
I don't have statistics or polling to hand that can give me a definitive answer on that. But what I'll say is that, again, anecdotally, I think there are very few Jews at the moment who live in the UK and also in many other places around the world who don't discuss more frequently the possibility that they might not want to stay living long term in the places where they are. And that's particularly tragic considering we're talking about people who predominantly were born in those places. So for British Jews at the moment to be thinking about the idea that they may not be comfortable living in the UK long term, many have in fact left even during this period, and others are preparing to. I think that's a horrible thought, and it's one that governments around Europe, within the UK, around the West ought to take far more seriously. There ought to be much more done to make sure that Jewish people know that they are protected rather than that they are a threat. I think on the contrary, though, we've seen a lack of robust response to anti-Semitism when it rears its ugly head in campuses, on university campuses, or in public places and public spaces. The fact that there have been these hate marches, as they were rightly called some time ago by the last government, the Conservative government, virtually every week or two for 15 months in London, is in itself very worrying for not just Jewish people, but many people who just want to go about their ordinary lives and who aren't posing this virulent opposition to Israel's justified war. Because remember, Israel is engaged in war with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip because those Palestinians in the Gaza Strip burst across the border and slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, took over 200 prisoners, kidnapped normal people from their beds in many instances, raped, tortured. They did the very worst things we can think of. And as a response, Israel reacted by going to war in Gaza to try to eliminate Hamas as a fighting force there and as the governing force of the Gaza Strip, after it had demonstrated exactly what its intentions and designs were on Israel and Jews, and then said that it would do it again and again and again if it could. I don't think anybody who's reasonable could look at the situation and think that Israel has any other option than to defend itself and then to try and eliminate that threat coming from Palestinian society, particularly in the Gaza Strip. And yet we've seen these marches week after week in London with the police not really reacting properly. I think both in the frequency of those marches, which have taken place for 15 months, more or less every week or two, and from the response from the police and government and other officials, many Jewish people are worried because they haven't been policed thoroughly. There haven't been enough signs that this is unacceptable. And it's not just Jewish people. Plenty of ordinary people want to go about their everyday lives, and this is incredibly disruptive to them. I think there is a very strong undercurrent of anti-Semitism in those marches, if not least in the sense that this virulent opposition to everything that the state of Israel does is utterly unjustified when we remember that Israel is engaged in this war with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip because those Palestinians burst across the border in their thousands and went into Israel to murder, kidnap, rape and torture Israelis, many from their homes or from a dance party. Bearing in mind that's what happened, I think any reasonable person knows that Israel's war is not just justified, but it's essential, because no country can live with an enemy on its border that doesn't just have that intention, but has actually carried out those acts, continues to keep those hostages that it took on that day with absolutely no contact with the Red Cross or the outside world. This is textbook genocidal anti-Semitism carried out by the Palestinians in Gaza. And Israel's response to that is therefore essential for its people and also for the whole world, to show that genocidal anti-Semitic terrorism cannot go unopposed. So I think the fact that in the UK we've seen not just the frequency of those marches and the relative popularity, remember it is a very noisy minority, but they're not a small minority, they come out in large numbers, and also the feeble response to it from especially the new government, but also the previous government, has been something that hasn't filled many Jewish people, I think, with a sense of security or confidence in the UK. And that's a problem that's repeated itself around the Western world, where those sorts of protests and those sorts of chants against Jewish people have just been seen over and over again with very little robust response. In America now, under Donald Trump's presidency, it looks like that might shift, but certainly here in the UK, I'm not sure there's any indication yet that there's going to be a change of heart.
This next question is a personal question that I've been having. I've been having an argument at the moment on Facebook, and I said that October the 7th was a genocide. Was October the 7th a genocide, according to definition?
As far as I can see, October the 7th does qualify as a genocide. And the reason for that is that genocide, under its technical legal definition, but also if you look into genocide studies, it's an academic pursuit which crosses various disciplines, psychology, law, history. It requires certain key elements which are definitely present in what the Palestinians did on October the 7th. So among those is an indoctrination of the population so that it is so hostile to whoever it sees as the enemy, the other, in this case, Israelis, Jews, that ordinary citizens can with some ease carry out absolutely brutal barbarity against those people. And we saw that on October the 7th, when there were not just Hamas terrorists who engaged in the slaughter, but also there were what they call ordinary Gazan civilians who came through the border as well. You could tell that that's who they were from their clothing. So the videos that they put out themselves showed people in ordinary civilian clothing, wearing even sandals, bludgeoning people to death with instruments like an agricultural hoe in one kibbutz. That, I think, does demonstrate one of the qualifying features of genocide. And similarly, the fact that the invasion of southern Israel was one which targeted mostly innocent civilians in their homes, in their beds, in the kibbutzim around the Gaza Strip, again, shows that this was designed as a slaughter. It was designed, if we look at the minutes of the Hamas meetings that took place in the years previous to the invasion, those have been published in part in the New York Times, we can see that there was a distinct plan, absolute intent is key in international law to qualify something as genocide, to carry out this brutal act against the Jewish people in Israel and others there in order to intimidate and degrade them, eventually, of course, to wipe them out, which is the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, of Hamas, which is a chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, and of Islamic terrorism that does confront Jews all around the world. So I personally would say that, yes, I think there is a strong case for arguing that the October the 7th invasion of Israel by the Palestinians would qualify as genocide. And I, of course, strongly believe that Israel's reaction to that does not.
Does it surprise you that Israel has the worst terror attack in its history, and they're chasing terrorists and trying to deal with Hamas in Gaza, and yet anti-Semitism rises? Does that shock you?
I wish it did shock me, but I don't think it does, because I think that Jewish people are aware that often anti-Semitism is irrational and has existed for, much of our history. And I will say that, even Christianity has a history of anti-Semitism. Of course, these days, the main threat towards Jews is not from Christians, it is from Islam and from Muslims. And the degree of anti-Semitism is actually central to Islamic doctrine and belief. If you read the Quran and the Hadiths, Jews are to be targeted for their disbelief in the Islamic belief system. So there is undoubtedly a strong history of anti-Semitism, and in modern times that often does get flared up in places like the UK or Europe when there is an instance of Israel defending itself against Muslim Palestinian terrorism in Israel and in its surrounding neighbours, where the threat comes from, as it did in October 2023 from Gaza. So it doesn't surprise me, but it is extremely distressing nonetheless to me and to many Jews that this happened. I think many were surprised because how on earth could this biggest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust be the thing which actually triggered more anti-Semitism around the world? It's just such a grotesque inversion of morality that the Jews' ability in the Jewish state of Israel to fight back against that kind of genocidal act would be the very thing that anti-Semites around the world would then hold against Israel, the Jewish state. But as I said, for me, I'm afraid to say it wasn't a massive surprise.
We've seen protests in universities. Are they indoctrinational hubs? And are Jews actually fearful to go to university today?
I've spoken to many Jewish parents and some Jewish students who indeed are afraid of what they will encounter when they go to universities, because we've seen how universities can be a hotbed for this kind of anti-Jewish activity. I think that's very distressing and another extremely strong sign that the government and authorities and university authorities need to act far more robustly in order to make clear that that's not acceptable in university campuses, that freedom of speech can never justify persecution of Jewish people or bullying of Jews or others who support the state of Israel in its actions to confront its enemies. Now, I do think that universities are, in some cases and in some ways, hotbeds for indoctrination. That's something which is perhaps the result of years of neglect by governments and university authorities who will have seen these things going on. They will have seen the seeds being planted and decided that it wasn't worth acting, often out of a respect for freedom of speech that has been misguidedly applied to allow racism against Jews and persecution of Jews to take root, and often out of a fear that some of the perpetrators, or at least ringleaders, of that indoctrination in the campuses have been Muslims or have been from certain communities which authorities are often afraid to criticize for fear of being seen as racist or politically incorrect. That's a problem that we will all have to face. We do already have to face it, but going forwards, we'll have to face it in the West, in liberal, democratic Western countries. Our freedoms have been abused by people who use them in order to engage in indoctrination and also to engage in a level of infiltration and takeovers. So often our own liberal values and liberal systems can be used in order to really indoctrinate people and take over in a way that is nefarious, malicious, racist, and harmful, not just to Jews, but to the whole of society. So I think that is one of the main issues we need to work out how to tackle. Of course, people bristle at the idea of limiting freedoms and limiting liberal considerations and values within our society in order to confront that. But I will say that in other instances, people have given up a degree of their liberties and freedoms. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, people gave up an extraordinary amount of their freedoms that we had always taken for granted as absolutely unquestionable and unlimitable in our lives, because they felt that there was a massive risk to the wider health, literal physical health of our society. And I would argue that now there is a similar risk to our cultural, ethical, moral health, and to our survival long term in the face of a threat which is very serious, currently aimed at Jews, but it won't stop there. It doesn't stop there. This is the kind of fundamentalism that has also been seen blowing up children in Manchester Arena or in tube bombings and numerous other acts of terrorism that have taken place around Britain and Europe. So this is something which we do need to confront.
And we've seen hostage posters being taken off walls when it's hostages who've been taken from their families, taken into Gaza in tunnels. We don't know what's happening to them, and we're getting testimonies of what's actually happened to them. And yet you're seeing people taking posters off walls because they hate Israel. It's terrible, isn't it?
You know, when people lose a pet, like a cat or a dog, they often put up a poster in the neighborhood to try to raise awareness, so that people can help return the missing animal if they find it. In this case, people weren't hoping that Brits literally could return the hostages if they put up posters, but it was a similar effort to raise awareness. Obviously, a far more important one. These people were not pets. They are human beings who were brutally seized from their homes, from their country, and kept in horrific circumstances and conditions in Gaza. The fact that people would willingly, wantonly, brazenly rip down those posters in public, proudly doing so, I think is yet another sign that there is a massive problem in our society. And it's not really about taking sides. The issue of hostages is a humanitarian issue that even if you're critical of the state of Israel in many ways, I think it's unjustifiable to defend the taking of hostages, their continued imprisonment, often torture and death. There's no way to justify that. That is a humanitarian issue that the world should have got behind immediately on October the 7th and 8th, 2023, when it happened. If more countries had put the right pressure on Hamas and, of course, its sponsors in Qatar and in the Islamic Republic of Iran, then perhaps we could have got to the moment where hostages were being returned far sooner than we did. And of course, those hostages who are being returned now will be permanently scarred emotionally and physically by their experience, as will their families be. And many have, of course, not even made it. There are many who are dead. So I think that the world really failed on October the 7th in its response, especially regarding the hostages. And the hostage posters was a sign of that. It was a symptom of that. That is what many ordinary people did at the time. They put up those posters to show their solidarity, their willingness to confront this, and they were failed by their governments who didn't put that necessary pressure in the right places in order to achieve the release. And we can just see that as soon as Donald Trump won the election and was not even in office, the pressure that he put on as the incoming US president helped very much to achieve some movement in relation to the hostages by the time he came into office earlier this month. So it was possible. And I think that Western countries should in some respects hang their heads in shame for their failure to have escalated the release of those hostages without conditions, without preconditions.
Anti-Semitism and Jew hate, it isn't normal for one group of people to receive such hate. Do you see this as spiritual at all?
Everybody's Judaism, I think, is specific and unique to them. It's very personal, as it is with any faith or ethnicity. How we relate to being Jews is unique to each of us. But we do, of course, share something collectively, whether it is religiously or spiritually, or whether it is historically. A sense of continuity of the Jewish people is also something that is fundamental to many, many Jews who feel part of a long chain stretching back in history. And I think that the racism and hatred that Jews have faced throughout our history is indeed something which can be read according to your own beliefs and feelings as either spiritual or political or social. The truth is it's probably a combination of all of these things. And, you know, without going into immense detail in this discussion, there are spiritual elements and religious elements. I think that, again, your audience is Christian. And I think that early Christian anti-Semitism may indeed have been partially inspired by a spiritual or religious consideration that Jews were the people who met Jesus face to face and yet didn't take on the beliefs of Christianity. And so I think later Christians who developed the religion after Jesus's time may well have wondered how those people might not have accepted Jesus as the Messiah. If that's the case, it's understandable that those early Christians may have thought badly of Jews and indeed engineered anti-Semitism against them as the people who rejected Jesus. This is a very brief and surface analysis of how something like that can come about, but I think that it is worth examining the origins of anti-Semitism in all eras of history and in all parts of our lives, because it's important if we're going to try and confront it. But as a Jewish person, I often think that sadly this is something we're always going to face as a people. And so while it is important to look at the reasons and motivations, it's going to be very difficult to eliminate it.
What are some of the things that you're doing to combat anti-Semitism?
Well, as a journalist and a commentator, I speak out frequently about anti-Semitism in my work and in speeches and in events that I'm invited to. And I think that's very important, because if you find yourself in a position where you have a platform for others to hear what you have to say, it's important to say what you think and feel and believe. It's also important to test constantly what you think and feel and believe, and make sure that your opinions and your analysis is as strong as you can make it. So I take the responsibility very seriously. And I'm also the son of a Holocaust survivor. My late father was a hidden child in Italy during the Holocaust. And so I grew up knowing his story for as long as I can remember. He was incidentally saved by the Catholic clergy in Florence in Italy, where he lived. As a 5-year-old, he was hidden first in a convent by nuns for 2 weeks. And then as the Nazis came to raid the convents around Florence, he was moved to a Catholic orphanage in the countryside nearby, where he was hidden for 9 months, along with his younger brother, who was 3 years old. Stories like that are not unusual for Jewish families. In fact, what's unusual about my father's story is that he survived, and so did his brother, and so did his parents, all of them going into hiding for that period, and with the great assistance of the local Catholic clergy there. That's unfortunately what's unusual about the story. Most Jewish families, including my own, have also stories of those who were murdered during the Holocaust. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep the memory of those people alive, but also to learn the lessons from that era, both to stand against anti-Semitism, but also to learn the lessons of the people like my father's saviors. Those people are, in my opinion, also my saviors. I wouldn't be here had they not defended and protected his life. And as a result, I'm eternally grateful to those people and those organizations who did that. And I think that we should all try to emulate those people. So in everything I do, I also try to help audiences or readers or whoever it is that I might be able to influence with my opinions and thoughts. I try to influence them to be bold and brave to stand up against these injustices taking place against Jewish people or any people, because I think that every person, the message of the saviors of Jews during the Holocaust, the non-Jewish saviors, is that very, very ordinary people can make a very big difference to humanity, whether they are peasants, teachers, nuns, diplomats. The righteous among the nations who are memorialized at Yad Vashem in Israel are people, non-Jews, who, at risk to their own life, saved Jewish people. And as a result, I think we can all learn a lot from those people in our actions going forwards. And I'm very gratified that I know over the last 15 months, many, many non-Jewish people who've spoken up boldly against what happened on October the 7th, and then what has continued to happen around the world against Jewish people. It's so important that we have the support of Christian friends and other friends who are similarly disgusted with this anti-Semitism that's rising around the world, but not just their support and their indications of sympathy, but also their actions, that they will stand up boldly against what's happening, and they will do everything in their own ability, in their circles, whether their circles are small or large, to fight back against this.
You've talked about church anti-Semitism, and the church has been very, very bad in the past. Have you seen a change now, where, particularly with the evangelical movement, loving and supporting and caring for Israel?
Well, that's a complex issue, because a lot of the evangelical movement does show a great deal of support for Israel, and I know that many in Israel are very grateful for that. There are also concerns among some that some evangelicals have a religious or doctrinal belief that the Messiah can come again when Jews are all gathered in Israel and accept Jesus. So to some extent, religiously, I can see that that is complex and difficult, because it's not something that Jews want. So That said, I think that support is very important wherever it comes from. And practically speaking, if we separate out issues of spiritual and theological beliefs, the support of others is vital, not just statistically, though statistically it's very vital. Jews are a tiny percentage of the world population. But it's important ethically and morally that in general we stand up for what's right. So if it is Jews who are being persecuted, then it is Jews who deserve the defense and solidarity of others. So when it comes to Christians and the church, there are many different faces of Christianity and different doctrines and thoughts. So I think it's very varied. There have been some who've been good and some who've been bad in that regard. I know there's been a lot of criticism for the Pope, for example, about some of the statements he's made over the last 15 months. And I don't want to wade into those discussions, but it's worth observing that religious leaders also have a responsibility to weigh their words very carefully and to consider the very stark realities of what's going on in Israel.
What is your prayer for Jews in the UK at the moment?
For me, I hope and pray that Jews will continue to be able to live safely and comfortably and confidently in the UK and to continue to contribute enormously to British life, as we've always done as a people. So my late godfather, Rabbi Abraham Levy, always used to say that Britain had been very good to the Jews and the Jews had been very good to Britain. So it is my hope and prayer that that should continue and that there should continue to be the climate for that to carry on for many, many years to come, and for Britain to continue to be good to its Jews, and for the Jews of Britain to continue to be good Britons themselves along with all their fellow countrymen and women.
What's your website for people who'd like to know more about the work that you do and perhaps listen to some other interviews that you've done?
Yes, I'm on most of the social media, from X to YouTube to Instagram. You can find all the links to my social media at my website, which is www.jonathansacerdoti.com. That's JONATHANSACERDOTI.com. So I'm very happy to have anyone follow me on those social media and to continue to join the fight against anti-Semitism.
Well, Johnathan, thank you very much for sharing today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us today. Pray that God will move by his mighty power in the Holy Land and bring his peace.